Hello everyone. So today we are going to start a new region or a subdivision of the abdomen, which is called as the pelvis or the pelvic cavity. As we have seen, the trunk, it is a large cavity which is divided into two parts by the transversely placed muscle called as the diaphragm. Above the diaphragm, the cavity of the trunk is called as the thoracic cavity, and below the diaphragm is the abdominal cavity. So diaphragm divides the trunk into the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. Now this abdominal cavity or whole of the abdomen, it extends from the diaphragm above to the floor of the pelvis, which is formed by the muscles of the pelvis, also called as the pelvic diaphragm. So extent of the abdomen is from the diaphragm, which is the thoraco-abdominal diaphragm, to the pelvic diaphragm. Now, this abdominal cavity is divided into two parts. From the diaphragm up to the pelvic inlet, this part is called as the abdominal cavity proper or the abdomen proper, and the lower part of the abdomen, that is below the pelvic inlet, this part is called as the pelvic cavity. So the abdomen is divided into the upper larger part called as the abdominal cavity proper, and the lower part is called as the pelvic cavity. So this part bounded by the two hip bones on both the sides and sacrum on the posterior side, this part is called as the pelvic cavity. So here up to the iliac crest, here upper part of the iliac crest, this is the abdomen, and below it this is the pelvis. Now this pelvis is again divided into two parts. The upper part, which is bounded by the ilium of the hip bones on both the sides, this part is called as the false pelvis, and below the pelvic inlet, this part is called as the true pelvis. So first, the abdomen is divided into abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. The pelvis is divided into the false pelvis and the true pelvis. The term pelvis means a basin. It is a basin-like structure, so called as the pelvis. Pelvis, the meaning of the word pelvis is basin. It is made up of hip bone, sacrum, and coccyx bound to each other by the ligaments. Here you can see the skeleton of the pelvis. It is formed by the hip bones on both the sides, sacrum posteriorly, and the coccyx in the lower part of the posterior side. So these three bones, the hip bone, sacrum, and the coccyx, forms the bony pelvis, the skeleton of the pelvis. Now this pelvis is divided into two parts. Now this part you can see, this is the superior ramus of the pelvis, and it continues as the arcuate line on the hip bone, which separates the ilium from the ischium and the pubis. Above this arcuate line, this part is the ilium. Below that arcuate line is the ischium on the posterior side and ilium on the anterior side. So this arcuate line and the superior ramus of the pubis, this forms the pelvic inlet. This part is called as the pelvic inlet. This is the pelvic inlet, and this is the anterior border of the sacral promontory. So this forms the pelvic inlet. The part of the pelvis above this pelvic inlet means this upper part, which is in the lower part of the abdomen. This is called as the false pelvis. It is the part of the pelvis, but here there are the organs of the abdomen. So it is called as the false pelvis. And the part of the pelvis below this pelvic inlet, this part below this pelvic inlet, this part is called as the true pelvis or the pelvic cavity proper. This part is the pelvic cavity proper. You can see the posterior view of the pelvis. This is the sacrum, and the lower part, this is the coccyx, and on both the sides these are the hip bones. This is the hip bone. Here, this you can see the posterior part of the true pelvis, and above this upper part is the false pelvis. The term pelvis means a basin. It is made up of hip bone, sacrum, and coccyx bound to each other by the ligaments. The anterior view of the pelvis, the hip bones, sacrum, and the coccyx. Here, the posterior view of the pelvis, the two hip bones on both the sides, sacrum, and the coccyx. The superior view of the pelvis. Here, this is the pelvic inlet. This upper part is the pelvic inlet, and below this pelvic inlet, this part is the pelvic cavity, and the lowermost part of this pelvic cavity, this will be the pelvic outlet. This forms the birth passage of the fetus from the pelvic inlet and through the pelvic outlet to the exterior. So it forms the passage for the parturition or passage for the birth of a baby. The functions of the pelvis: it contains and protects the pelvic viscera. As the abdomen have the abdominal viscera, in the pelvis there is the pelvic viscera. This pelvic viscera, it includes the organs of the urinary system, digestive system, like the urinary bladder and rectum, present in both the sexes, in males and females. Along with these two organs, in females there is also the uterus. The large organ present in females is the uterus. So it contains and protects the pelvic viscera, urinary bladder and rectum in both the sexes, and uterus in females. It supports the weight of the body and transmits it to the lower limbs successively through sacrum, sacroiliac joints, hip bones, and then to femur in the standing position and ischial tuberosities in the sitting position. The lowermost part of the pelvis or the hip bone are the ischial tuberosity. In the sitting position, through these hip bones and through the ischial tuberosity, the weight of the body is transmitted to the ground. And in the standing position, through the hip joint, here through this hip joint, the body weight is transmitted to the femur, and from femur to the tibia, and from tibia to the talus and calcaneus, and to the ground in the standing position. And in the sitting position, the weight of the body is transmitted through this ischial tuberosity. So in both the positions, whether standing or the sitting position, the weight of the body is transmitted to the pelvis. It supports the weight of the body and transmits it to the lower limbs successively through sacrum, sacroiliac joints, hip bones, and then to femur in the standing position and ischial tuberosities in the sitting position. It provides attachments for muscles, the pelvic muscles, which closes the pelvic cavity from the lower side and forms the pelvic diaphragm. These are attached on the hip bones or to the bony pelvis. And additionally, in the female, it provides the bony support for the birth canal or birth passage. And accordingly, the shape of the male pelvis and female pelvis are different. The female pelvis is mainly meant for the birth passage. So accordingly, the shape of the female pelvis will be different from the male pelvis. Differences between male and female pelvis. The differences between the male and female pelvis are principally associated with the following points. First, males have stronger muscles, thicker bones, and prominent bony markings. So obviously these features will also seen on the pelvis. The muscles attached to the pelvis will be more stronger. The bones of the pelvis are more thicker, and as the bones are more thicker, so the bony markings are also more prominent in males than the females. Then second point is to provide passage to the baby during parturition. The pelvic cavity is comparatively wider and shallower in the female. So accordingly, there are the differences in certain features of the male and female pelvis that we'll see one by one. Here you can see this is the structure of the male pelvis and the female pelvis. Now we'll see the differences between male pelvis and female pelvis one by one. The general structure of male pelvis is heavy and thick, and that of female pelvis is light and thin. Here is the male pelvis. You can find it is heavy and thick, and it is light and thin. Then second, articular surfaces are large on male pelvis and they are small in female pelvis. Muscle attachments are well marked in male pelvis and they are indistinct or not very prominent or not well marked on the female pelvis. The false pelvis is deep while the female pelvis is shallow. Now see this difference. This false pelvis means this upper part above the pelvic inlet. This false pelvis in males it is deep than the females. In females this false pelvis is shallow. It is not much deep in females. It is more deeper in females. The pelvic the pelvic inlet of males is heart shaped while that of female pelvis is oval. Here you can see this is the pelvic inlet. It is narrower and this is the sacral promontory, the anterior border of the body of the sacrum. This part it is the body of the sacrum and this anterior border. This is the sacral promontory. This sacral promontory is more wider in males, is more prominent in males, not wider, more prominent in males. So it is more projected inwards. So because of this, the pelvic inlet is heart shaped, while the sacrum and the ala of the sacrum, this is the posterior part, this is the sacrum. The sacrum is more wider in females than the males. In males it is more longer, in females it is shorter and wider. As it is wider, the pelvic inlet is oval shaped. This is oval. The shape of the pelvic inlet in females is oval. The pelvic inlet in males it is heart shaped. The false pelvis is deep and shallow, deep in males and shallow in females. Pelvic inlet is heart shaped in males and oval in female. Here you can see this is the female pelvis. It is short. The female pelvis is short, it is shallow and more wider. And this is the male pelvis, it is more deeper. It is deeper and here it is not very much broad. The female pelvis it is broad, it is wider. The pelvic cavity of males is smaller and deeper. Pelvic cavity is the part of the pelvis in between the pelvic inlet and the pelvic outlet. So this pelvic cavity it is smaller and deeper in males, while in females it is wider and shallower. As the pelvic inlet is wider in females, the pelvic cavity is also wider in females and it is shallower, it is not much deep, while that of the males it is smaller and deeper. The structure of the male pelvis, here the male pelvis it is more longer, the female pelvis it is more shorter. So this pelvic cavity it is more broader, more wider in females and also the depth is less, it is shallow, while that of the male pelvis the depth is more in the male pelvis. The pelvic cavity is smaller and deeper, it is wider and shallower in females. The pelvic outlet is smaller with ischial tuberosities turned inside. Here when we see the superior view, here is the ischial tuberosity. Okay, this ischial tuberosity is more projected inwards in males while they are more projected outwards in females. Here it is not seen here. The ischial tuberosity they are more on the outer side in females and that in males it is more on the inner side. The smaller the pelvic outlet is smaller with ischial tuberosities turned inside. The pelvic outlet is bigger with everted ischial tuberosities, means ischial tuberosities are more projected on the outer side, not on the inner side. Then sacrum is narrow and longer in males. It is shorter and wider in females. The subpubic angle is narrower 50 to 60 degrees in males and it is wider 80 to 85 degree in females. here there is a subpubic angle which is in between the pubic arches of both the sides, between the pubic bones of both the sides. It is less than, means it is 50 to 60 degree, less than 90 degrees in males, narrower in males and broader in females, more than, it is about 80 to 85 degrees in females, means it is more wider. Here this is the inlet, it is heart shaped in males and it is wider oval in females. Then the greater sciatic notch, in males it is narrow, while in females it is wider. The angle of greater sciatic notch is 50 degrees in males, in females it is 75 degrees. It is wider. Inferior pubic ramus presents a strong everted surface for attachment of the crus of the penis. Here is the inferior pubic ramus. This one, this is the inferior pubic ramus, and this one, it is a male pelvis, male, the inferior ramus of the pubis of the male pelvis. Here you can see this is the rough area, because these are the everted projections on the inferior ramus of the pubis, because the crus of penis are attached to this part, so they are everted in males, and these are smooth, these are absent in the female pelvis. Here you can see, easily find out the differences. Here the male pelvis, it is everted, and in female pelvis it is smooth, it is not, those are absent, those eversions are absent. The inferior pubic ramus presents a strong everted surface for attachment of the crus of the penis. This marking is absent in the females. Then acetabulum is large in males, it is small in females. Obturator foramen is smaller and triangular, while it is larger and oval in females. So all these features, it makes the female pelvis more wider than the male pelvis. Here is the female pelvis, it is oval. The sacrum, it is narrower, it is not broad, it is not wide. Here some of the differences can be seen in the female pelvis and the male pelvis. The female pelvis is shorter, male pelvis is longer. It is more deeper, pelvic cavity is more deeper in the male pelvis, it is shallower in the female pelvis. The sacrum, you can see the differences in the sacrum. Sacrum is narrow. Here the male pelvis, the sacrum is narrow in male pelvis, it is broad in female pelvis. Here is broader sacrum, and this is the sacral promontory, the body of the sacrum. There are also the differences. Here the oval pelvic inlet is the heart shaped pelvic inlet. The greater sciatic notch, this one, it is the greater sciatic notch, it is this one, the shape is different, it is more wider in females than the males. Here you can see it is very sharp in males, and in females it is more wider. So these are the differences in the male pelvis and the female pelvis, and the general structure of the pelvis. In the next lecture we study the muscles of the pelvis and the pelvic diaphragm. In today's topic, 2 marks questions are asked on the differences between the male pelvis and the female pelvis.